So just so you know, if you can stay until we're done, but if you're leaving after 5, somebody has to escort you to the elevators, which are through the lot doors. So if you want to get out of Dodge, or the escalators, just run before 5, and then after 5, you'll need an escort.
That's right.
Just a great for me to be part of that.
Colleagues on their way.
I think they're imminent.
Oh my God, you're so fast. Thank you. Thank you. Yes. Should be fine. Yeah. Let me
See your
FRRACS.
Yes.
Oh yeah. I know. Okay.
Everybody ready? Okay. Close the middle door, please. Okay, if the department could call its next witness, please.
Sandra Baird, please.
Good afternoon, Dr. Baird. Hello. And I'll remind you to speak into the microphone. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you will give today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Good afternoon. Could you introduce yourself, please, for the record?
Dr. Sandra J.S. Baird,
Where are you employed,
Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection,
and at what address?
1 Winter Street.
Have you, Dr. Baird, have you submitted pre-filed testimony on behalf of the department in this matter?
Yes,
Do you have that with you?
yes,
Did you sign that testimony under the pains and penalties of perjury?
yes,
Do you wish to make any changes to that testimony?
no,
Do you now adopt that testimony for purposes of this hearing?
yes.
Thank you.
Dr. Baird is available for cross-examination.
Good afternoon, Dr. Baird. My name is Bryan Bertram. I'm here representing the town of Weymouth. Hopefully I don't have to say good evening at any point during this. Just gotta start off as I do with all of the staff members. We know you are all very busy, and we appreciate you taking the time today. And I will keep my voice up. I need to work on that. Just want to actually start. When did you start work at MassDEP?
I started in 2006.
Starting in 2006 through the present time, have you always worked with the allowable ambient limits and the threshold exposure effector, the TDLs?
Yes,
Okay. All right, so and there's never been a break in that? You've been working with those for that entire time?
I've worked on those as well as other projects.
Okay. Fair enough. Are you familiar then with MassDEP's policies, guidances, written documentations that concern the AALs and TELs?
I'm familiar with the documents relating to the development of the AALs and TELs.
Are you familiar with a document dated August 1989, Department of Environmental Protection, Division of Air Control, or Air Quality Control, Air Toxics Implementation Update?
Yes,
Okay. You've seen that document before?
yes,
You know, it was attached as an exhibit to, it was Glenn Keith's testimony.
people say so.
Fair enough. You understand that that document references a longstanding protocol for air toxics modeling that considers the emissions from only proposed projects such as this one and not background.
Yes.
Sitting here today, are you aware of any other policies, guidance, written documents from MassDEP that explicitly set forth those long-standing protocols as they've been described?
In the, so yes, in the updating methodology, we refer to the purpose of the AALs and TELs is to guide in the setting of air toxics for pollution sources.
And you interpret that text to mean that the AALs and the TELs are to be applied only to a source and not to consider background.
Yes.
Sitting here today, is there anything else?
The chem and all documentation, which is also includes language to that effect.
I'm sorry, could you either repeat your answer to the last question or read it back? I just didn't hear it.
Oh, I'm sorry, the chem and all documentation
Thank you.
also includes.
Well, let's turn your pre-filed testimony. You have that with you?
Yes, I do.
Did you attach to that,
I'm sorry, can you hear?
sorry. Did you attach to that guidelines for the AALs and the TELs from 2011?
I did.
Okay. And is that the most current set?
That is,
Okay. You have those in front of you?
I do.
Let's turn to those. To flip to here we go. So section 6. So page 22 is in section 6, 6.6, and when you're there, just let me know.
I'm there.
Okay. If you go to 6.6.1, it reads children's health. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, I'm just going to read that. Tell me if I read it incorrectly. MassDEP is developing guidance to incorporate quantitative consideration of increased susceptibility of children in future guidance values. MassDEP's guidance will build on the work of US EPA, Cal EPA, and others. Did I read that correctly?
Yes.
Has MassDEP in fact developed that guidance?
We have not.
What is the purpose of doing so?
The purpose of developing guidance is to set forth the approach that one would take to setting specific policies.
That hasn't been done to date.
No, that has not been done today.
And if you go down to section 6.6.2, again, correct me if I read it wrong, it's entitled less than lifetime exposure. Is that correct?
That's correct.
I'm going to read it. MassDEP plans to develop guidance for developing toxicity values for less than lifetime exposures to residents, including children. Did I read that correctly?
Yes, you did.
Okay. And has MassDEP to date developed that guidance?
We have not.
the allowable ambient limits. Those are set at concentrations that MassDEP considers to be protective of the public health. Is that correct?
Yes,
And that's at a 1 in 1 million cancer risk for certain of them?
yes,
Okay. I'm just trying to be careful. I understand that not all compounds are necessarily cancer causing, correct?
correct.
But formaldehyde is one, correct?
Formaldehyde is, yes.
Okay. And that's set at the 1 in 1 million cancer risk. Is that correct?
Yes,
Okay. Just to be clear, that represents MassDEP's best judgment of what is the right concentration level to be protective of public health.
yes,
And if one were to see a concentration in excess of an AAL, that would go beyond what MassDEP considers sufficiently protective of the public health?
it would depend. And I guess I would just say it would depend on the context and, other considerations.
So it's called an allowable ambient limit, correct?
Yes, that was,
And they've been called allowable ambient limits since the 1980s, correct?
that's correct.
Is your understanding that is something that can be exceeded?
In what sense?
Well, does a limit set a ceiling?
It does in the context of these values being derived to aid in having facilities not contributed to the air cancer-causing health.
It sets, do you believe that it sets the limit for the level of concentration that a facility should put a compound into the air?
Yes,
That's based, again, on MassDEP's assessment of what is sufficiently protective of the public health.
yes,
Would it be a cap on emissions at an applicable AAL or TEL?
I don't know.
One moment, we've been self-editing a little bit to keep this short, so. Can you turn to your rebuttal testimony?
Sure.
Paragraph 8, top of page 4, last sentence of that paragraph. Just let me know when we get there.
Paragraph
I'm going to read that last sentence.
Okay.
Are you good?
8, there.
Okay, making sure. AALs and TELs are a generic tool rather than a site-specific approach, and thus do not provide for modification either up or down. Did I read that correctly?
He did.
Okay. When you write generic tool, can you explain what you mean by that phrase?
The AALs and TELs apply to all facilities, or they would apply where it's appropriate to a facility. They are set at levels which are determined to be protective of human health. They're not modified for particular facilities or particular situations. They remain as they are.
And you're a toxicologist?
I am.
Do you have any understanding of risk assessment?
I do.
And so, based on your knowledge in that area, if one wanted to do a site-specific analysis, could one do that if they had appropriate data?
I'm not sure this is within the scope of our testimony.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure.
I'm not sure this is within the scope of our testimony.
Mr. Bertram, are you asking still with regard to paragraph 8?
Yeah, I am. I'm not going to go very far. I just basically want to get into a little bit of this. It's not a site-specific approach. I just want to reduce that it would be possible to do that if somebody wanted to do it, as the issue goes.
I'll allow that.
I mean, would it be possible to do a site-specific analysis?
It is possible to do a site-specific analysis.
Okay, if one, for example, had relevant actual data for the site?
That could be one piece of information that would be used in a site-specific.
Is there any others that come to mind? This is not, just,
It would, when we're looking at a site-specific, you have to take into consideration multiple sources, what potential exposure pathways might be, and then do that evaluation.
all right, so it's possible.
It's possible.
And going back to the AALs and the TELs, one thing MassDEP could do if an AAL or a TEL was exceeded would be to conduct a site-specific analysis. Is that a fair statement?
I have to say that it's possible. It is when an AAL or TEL is exceeded, is usually in the context of someone proposing a project or evaluating a project. And at that point in time, what happens next is not a part of my work.
I understand. That actually helps me out. Sometimes we have to guess a little bit about where everyone fits in. So just to be clear then, your sort of scope of responsibility at the department is in developing the AALs and the TELs, but I guess it stops at implementing it to specific projects. Is that a fair characterization?
Yes.
Nothing further at this time, Ms. Rothschild. Thank you, Dr.
Mr. Goldrosen, Mr. Hayden, you chosen an order?
Dr. Baird, I'm John Goldrosen, representing the town of Braintree, and I too thank you for being here, what I would consider after hours, as well as all week. If I could ask you to look at your rebuttal testimony, paragraph 10.
Paragraph 10?
Yes. And really, it's paragraphs 9 and 10. You use the term cumulative risk. Could you explain to us your understanding of that term, maybe differentiated from additive risk?
Additive risk is one way that risk could be combined into a cumulative risk. So you can have risks. So that in order to have a cumulative risk, you need to have more than one thing that you're putting together. So when you put things together, particularly say in the context of a chemical, you can have no difference between putting the two together, or you could have an additive response where they add those effects increase together. You could have an antagonistic response where one would block the response of the other, or you could have a synergistic response where one would potentiate and create more than the sum of the two together.
And when you say more than one risk, do you mean more than one source of a single chemical, or more than one chemical, maybe both? Could you elaborate on that?
It depends on the context of the question. So if you're thinking about the way chemicals interact with the body, if you have the same chemical from two different sources, then depending on the exact way the exposures occur, you could then have an additive response. And in fact, in risk assessment, we often use additive response, assume additivity as a health protective approach.
Do you mean that you assume that there would be an additive response? Am I saying that? For purposes of risk
For
assessment?
purposes of, say, a site-based risk assessment, you might assume that given the proper exposure context, space and time, where people would be, that those, you could have an additive effect.
All right, thank you. That's helpful. I'm going to go back to the one in a million, the shorthand called it the 1 in a million guideline or value. Looking at your direct testimony at paragraph 12, and I think this sort of follows on what you said in previous paragraphs explaining the origin or the basis for the 1 in a million lifetime cancer risk guideline. And in the last sentence of paragraph 12, you say a 1 in 1 million lifetime cancer risk is considered de minimis or no significant risk in most federal and state programs. Paragraph finishes with reference to the MCP. So would a risk above 1 in a million and 1 in 1 million, and to be clearer, if there's a risk of, say, 1 in 500,000, would you consider that a significant risk?
I would think that that is still a very small risk.
But it's not no significant risk.
So that's, significant means different things to different people. And so the policy and the judgment through the course of risk assessment and risk analysis and through legal means it's been that 1 in a million is considered to be a de minimis risk, to not be a significant risk. Above that risk, in your example of 1 in 500,000, is still below what is considered a de minimis or a acceptable risk in other contexts. So it depends on the context.
So can you give an example of a context in which it would be an acceptable risk? Let's say 1 in 500,000.
That would be an acceptable risk in, say, for example, the MCP, if they did a site-based risk assessment.
And I think, if I sense a hesitation in the way you answered the previous question, I'm sensing, is the 1 in a million standard a policy decision as to what is significant from a policy perspective?
Well, it reflects that different people have different views of risks, and that this has been determined, it's a very small risk. One chance in 1 million is a very small risk. And that is why it has been sort of agreed upon as a de minimis risk.
From your point of view as a toxicologist, setting aside what policy decisions might be made, perhaps by others, but from your experience and your studies and your professional judgment as a toxicologist, is there a significant risk if the risk is more than 1 in 1 million?
It depends on how much bigger it is.
All right. Let me go to your let's go back to rebuttal testimony, paragraph 10. And the very last sentence on put down is at the bottom of page 4.
Yes.
That's the end of the that is the end of paragraph 10. You say at very low concentrations, the chance of synergistic or antagonistic interactions between chemicals is low and assumed to be additive in the risk assessment context. That's what you were referring to earlier when we had the exchange about whether there's an assumption of risk being additive. Is that correct?
Yes.
And when you say at very low concentrations, do you mean by that lower than 1 in 1 million?
No. isn't only at concentrations where the risk would be 1 in a million, where the concentration would be low enough that we would be not, where it is very unlikely that an antagonistic or a synergistic effect would occur.
So that sentence follows the sentence in which you refer to the 1 in 1 million policy decision, but you didn't, if I understand you right, you didn't mean the last sentence then to sort of follow the previous sentence and refer to risks that were lower than 1 in 1 million. Is that correct? That was the way I read it, and that was why I asked the question.
So the beginning of the next sentence starts with concentrations. And so we set acceptable, so we use acceptable risk as a tool using the toxicity information to set a concentration. And then when we think about concentrations, we think about how they have to interact with the body. So if you have very low concentration that would be associated with a 1 in a million cancer risk, typically, we're also talking about very few molecules of that chemical interacting in the body, so there's less opportunity for chemicals to interact when there's not very many of them.
And that is why the interaction is less likely to be either synergistic or antagonistic, because in fact there won't be interaction. Is that, am I understanding?
Yes.
That? I have no further questions.
Thank you.
Mr. Hayden.
Thank you, Ms. Rothschild. Good afternoon, Dr. Baird.
Hello.
A few minutes ago, you referenced the MAPC.
MCP.
Okay, I misheard you.
There's a lot of M's and acronyms floating around.
Fair enough. If I could draw your attention to paragraph 15 of your pre-file testimony. The last sentence, would you read that for us?
When there is chemical-specific information about the potential for additional sources of exposure, this can be used to select a relative source contribution factor other than the 20%.
Is this consistent with your responses to Attorney Bertram's questions about whether a site-specific risk assessment plan is possible?
The relative source contribution factor is a factor that's included within the threshold effects exposure limits.
And here you're referring to chemical-specific information about the potential for additional sources of exposure.
So in this case, as described in the updating methodology 2011, we're talking about the potential for exposure in addition to air. So some chemicals, you can be exposed to them in water or food or in indoor air. And so that is what the relative source contribution factor is taking into account. This is because when you're setting a limit or a level, we want to make sure that we're accounting for other potential exposures so that the total exposure that someone would get would still be below a health protective level.
And do you account for nearby sources of air toxins?
We do not.
So you account for everything else that might expose an individual to particular chemicals, but you exclude one readily apparent source of nearby air toxins.
Relative source contribution factors are selected when, during the process of developing the threshold effect exposure level. And in fact, we did an evaluation to determine whether we should retain the relative source contribution factor of 20% or perhaps have chemical specific values or perhaps not include one when we went through the process of updating our methodology.
And I follow you. I understand why you want to look at water, soil, food, and indoor air, because you want to understand if the body's being exposed to specific chemicals in addition to the proposed facility under review, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so since water, soil, food, and indoor air are important enough for you to specifically consider them, why aren't nearby sources of air toxics equally important for you to consider when determining relative source contribution?
The relative source contribution is selected, or in this case, the default is used unless there's other information when we develop the threshold effect exposure level. It is not associated with any particular site. It relates to the ability of the chemical to be available from other media and in other sources. It's not related to, in any way, to the ambient air that's here or here or here. It is related to, it's a health protective approach that decreases the amount of the chemical that a facility is allowed to emit. And otherwise, if we didn't use, they could emit at the level of the toxicity values that are acceptable for a lifetime of exposure. This is a way of making sure that the proponent is not contributing enough of the chemical in order to reach that higher level, which is which is a health protective level. We want to make sure that the emissions are below that level.
Okay, let's see where we agree. Relative source contributions are a health protective approach. Do you agree?
Yes.
And when there's chemical-specific information about the potential for additional sources of exposure, this can be used to select a relative source contribution other than the default. Do you agree?
That is what the language says, but you're misinterpreting the use of chemical-specific information in this context.
Okay. I'm not attempting to interpret anything. I'm just asking if that's what your testimony was.
That is what my testimony is.
If I could turn your attention to your rebuttal testimony, paragraph 10. First sentence, you agree that cancer risk from exposure to multiple carcinogenic chemicals may be cumulative, correct?
Yes.
If I could draw your attention, please, to what was marked as exhibit number 23.
I don't have it.
It's the Oregon memo.
Thank you.
Mr. Rothschild, I'm just going to wait until Attorney Fallon and Attorney Dingle locate the document. Thank you. Okay. Dr. Baird, again, within the scope of your rebuttal testimony that discusses exposure to multiple carcinogenic chemicals having a cumulative effect on cancer risk, I'd like to draw your attention to page 11 of Exhibit 23. Do you see the section entitled Summary of Considerations for Cumulative Risk from Multiple Sources Within an Area?
I do.
Would you read the first bulleted point followed by the bulleted point below it?
Including cumulative risk from nearby industrial facilities in the permitting program, is more protective of human health, sensitive populations, and overburdened communities than not including it, and better represents the air people are actually breathing.
Do you agree with that statement?
Yes.
And the next darkened bulleted point that begins with if cumulative, could you read that line for me?
Yes. If cumulative effects are included, cancer risk from individual chemicals should be summed, while non-cancer risk from multiple chemicals affecting the same organ should be summed.
Do you agree with that statement?
Yes.
This is going to sound very similar, but the wording of the introductory sentence is slightly different. If I could turn your attention to page 14 of Exhibit 23. if you could repeat that same exercise for me, read the first bulleted sentence followed by the next bulleted sentence beneath it.
Including contributions from sources beyond the permitted facility in a geographically defined region in the permitting program, is more protective of human health, sensitive populations, and overburdened communities than not including it, and better represents the air which people actually breathe.
Do you agree with that statement?
Yes?
If I could have one moment, Ms. Rothschild, that may be all I have.
Okay.
Those are all the questions I have. Thank you very much for your time, Dr. Baird.
Any redirect, Mr. Dingle? Thank you, Dr. Baird. Thank you.
The Cheminol, CHEM.
Department, call its next witness, please.
Tom Cushing.
Yes.